Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about, is HyperSmell the real ADHD superpower? So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes. If there's questions while I'm talking, you can type them in. I'll try to get to them at the end. And I am still dealing with some back pain, so if I am grimacing or making faces, don't take it personally. So I'll start out with my take-home message, and the preface for this one is that this topic of ability to smell and ADHD is the most scantily researched of all those topics I probably touched on so far. And it's not just scantily researched, it is conflictingly researched. But there are about 3 studies suggesting that children with ADHD are substantially better than neurotypical children at detecting smells. And this is one of the few areas where people with ADHD as a group are clearly outperforming neurotypical individuals. There certainly can be situations with distracting noise or other situations where ADHD may be a benefit, but this is sort of an absolute neurophysiologic measure, which shows a superiority. So some people propose this may be the ADHD superpower, and others have proposed that children with ADHD are different enough on their ability to detect smells that this may eventually become a biomarker or test for ADHD. I think that's pretty premature, and in my end of the summary is that the results in adults is pretty conflicting and not showing consistent advantages for smell. So part of why I got into this topic is I did get, over the last months, a few different inquiries, and they came from both ends of the spectrum. Some people were saying, I have ADHD and I seem hypersensitive to smells, and is that common to people with ADHD? And the other end of the spectrum, people either commenting in themselves or in others that I have ADHD and I seem to be less aware or less attuned to smells than other people. And there is also a little bit of data suggesting that maybe people with ADHD are overrepresented at both ends of the spectrum. And some of the confusion is that there are differences, a basic difference just between sensitivity to smell and whether you can actually detect the smell, and whether you are aware of it and processing it and can discuss that or bring it to conscious awareness. So I'll jump backwards a little bit into olfaction itself. So olfaction, or the sense of smell, or chemosensing, we have different terms for it, is one of our senses. It's certainly one that's gotten an unduly little amount of attention up until now. Many people have cheered on that, yay, during COVID. I'm being flippant here, that so many people during COVID have suffered either acutely. 40 to 50% of people with COVID lost smell for at least some period of time, and or had disrupted sense of smell. And up to 10% of people with long COVID have ongoing impairment of smell. So this impairment of smell is making us more aware of a vital sense that we don't spend a lot of time paying conscious attention to. So that's one positive thing of the COVID. The other aspect that is discussed less is, I think, in terms of body language, just being able to see a torso, um, you know, our visual information, our auditory information, it gets pretty well displayed across a screen, and Google and others are working on it. But right now we are completely separated from our usual olfactory chemosensory information, which is a vital part of interhuman communication. So our lack of getting smell information in that setting, it's not that when you're sitting at your desk and remote working, you're not getting smells, you are, but they are different than if you were interacting with the people you might normally interact with in a workplace. So smell is where olfaction is finally getting its place in the sun, and it's going to get much more attention in the years ahead. So some interesting and important things about the human olfactory system. One, it's one of the it's the only sensory system where the nerve is actually directly immersed in the world it's sensing. So yes, our retinas are an extension of our brain, um, but the retina is protected by the lens. It's protected by the vitreous humor. There's a buffer between what we're seeing and retinal activation. Our ears, the hair cells in the ears, the hammer, anvil, stapes, the ossicles, the bones have to transform sound into something the nerves can process. But with olfaction, the nerves are directly responding. So the nerves are sticking out into the world. There's the back of the nose and back of the upper throat and nose. So that's a more direct input to our central nervous system than our other sensory systems have. Another interesting thing about this is that most of our other senses get processed through midbrain thalamic entities before we're making any sense of them in a sensory way. So visual information goes through the thalamus, auditory information, yes, there is some visual information that jumps off at the suprachiasmatic nucleus into your clock, tiny, tiny bit. Whereas with olfactory sensation, most of that is processed outside of the thalamus. So it's, again, a more direct, shorter pathway. And some of the pathways that the olfactory system, again, it starts with the mucous membrane and the epithelium in the back of the nose and throat. There are nerve receptors there that convey signals up olfactory nerves through the cribriform plates. So they're honeycombed holes in a base of the brain, into the base of the brain, and sitting on top of that cribriform plate is your olfactory bulb, which is a collection of nerve receptors processing smell. And that olfactory bulb is pretty close to both frontal areas of the brain, which are involved in a whole bunch of personality, individual thinking, and really closely tied to the limbic system as well. So part of the power of olfaction may be its closer, more direct, fewer links to get into higher brain processes. Other cool things about the olfactory system is that they are cells, nerves of the human brain that are capable of regeneration. So there is a big capacity for the system to recuperate from damage. A few other things are we are constantly using our olfactory system, even if we're not consciously aware that we are actively sniffing, engaging, drawing olfactant, smelling molecules into our nose. But we are. And that the human smell system is actually a pretty good one. We often compare ourselves poorly to pigs or dogs or other animals. But in interesting experiments done a few decades ago by Noam Sobel, he was at UC Berkeley then, he's blanking, he's at a Weitzman Institute, I believe, in Israel right now. He had volunteers who could follow a trail with their nose of scent through the grass, and you could follow it, extremely accurately. What helped actually in terms of following an olfactory trail was to have all your other senses blocked off. So your vision blocked off, your tactile sensation, your ears, because most of the information we're getting from our other sensory channels, we pay much more attention to, and we're not paying direct attention to our smell. But if you are forced to situation and forced yourself to rely on it, we are pretty good smellers. And in his studies, people could follow a scent trail through the grass on their hands and knees as fast as they could crawl. So crawling was the limiting factor. It wasn't the ability to detect scents. Get strong, important information. How we decide who are going to be our friends, there is important information coming from our sense of smell to that. So this is not an ADD anecdote or research, but article that got a fair amount of attention just in the last month was a research project on social anxiety. They were using a meditative approach to help people with social anxiety become more comfortable in a social situation. And what they did was expose these individuals with social anxiety to sweat or to no sweat from people who were watching either a scary movie or a happy movie. And both the happy sweat and the scary sweat compared to the no sweat condition, improved performance, actually doubled the efficacy of the meditation mindfulness in reducing anxiety. So again, smelling someone helped make a mindfulness approach to reducing anxiety much more effective. And again, what's kind of interesting is this isn't social anxiety. These are people who may be more wary or more sensitive or more afraid of other, may also be importantly doing, and again, not well understood or conceptualized now, is helping regulate our autonomic nervous system. So I've talked before about the parasympathetic, the startle arousal, the sympathetic nervous system that stimulants tap into, the startle arousal fight or flight system, and the balancing parasympathetic nervous system. And part of maintaining that balance and part of a 2.5-hour cycle of nasal flow is probably tied into our sense of smell. So jumping back from smell in general and getting back to the ADHD research, there are at least 3 different studies looking at, so 1 or 2 more words. Part of what's difficult about studying smell is that we don't have a good or useful language for doing it. We have a more intricate testing system. So visual cues, we can put all sorts of visual designs up. We can describe precisely in terms of size, orientation of lines, wavelength of color, how we are varying the visual stimuli, or with acoustic stimuli, we can change the volume, change the pitch, change, things are varying on a spectrum. And with olfaction, we are working in a more categorical system. And many people have thought that our sense of smell is individualistic, that it's hard to know what someone else is describing the same thing, but they've actually done a fair amount of work that people tend to describe that our olfactory maps are actually remarkably similar, not identical, and there are people who love chocolate and hate vanilla and vice versa, but in general, there are striking similarities in terms of how closely related we think different smells are, and general correlations across people in terms of their pleasantness or aversiveness. And they're developing algorithms right now for more precisely mapping out and being able to predict, if I expose these chemicals to you, what do you sense is going there on an olfactory level. So right now, most of smell testing is collections of several dozen agreed upon smells that we have test smell kits, and we expose individuals to those smells, and you display them at a certain dose in the nasal cavity, and see how sensitive people are at detecting them. And in the ADD research, there's a few studies with kids showing that the kids with ADHD were substantially better at picking. So they had a lower threshold, which means they could detect the scents at a lower level of concentration. Additional studies with kids with ADHD, one study showed that kids with ADHD also had a larger olfactory bulb, which would fit well with if you are using their smelling, kids with ADHD, their smelling gets worse than normal ADHD kids and more like normal kids. Conversely, there's at least one study in just people with obesity, not with any ADHD in the picture, where stimulants given to people with obesity actually improve their olfactory sensitivity. So we know that dopamine processes in the frontal brain are involved with both with ADHD and with smell sensitivity, but what's going on between the two is complex. So again, unfortunately, even though there's a handful of small studies in children showing the superiority, in adults, there's much less consistent data. So there's some data showing most adults with ADHD actually have impairment of olfactory sensitivity. There's other studies showing no difference between adults with ADHD and neurotypical adults. Although one of the groups, again, pushing that this in kids may be a real biomarker, felt that the difference, the separation was so robust that it could be used. We certainly need to do much more research to find out how how substantial that is. And then other confounding factors are, we known, and we've talked about it here, that there is a big overlap between ASD, autism spectrum disorders, and sensory processing problems are much more prevalent in the autism spectrum than in ADD per se. So there's a possibility, again, the study looking at ADHD and olfactory sensitivity was tried to get a pure ADHD picture without autism, I'll just say contamination, confusion, confounding. But it's, again, there's very little data here. So I would actually not promote HyperSmell as an ADHD superpower. I think being able to appreciate our differences, and it's not just how we are different, but what context each of our traits or weaknesses or strengths are able to display themselves is probably more important than ranking something as a superpower or something like that. Getting a little more clinically, there's one other area, there's some research with ADHD and smell, and that is, again, a generalization that has not been completely substantiated, as many people with ADHD are picky eaters. Now, are they picky eaters because they are hypersensitive to taste, or are they picky eaters for sensitive to other reasons? And the studies there are actually completely conflicting. Some showed they couldn't actually find that kids with ADHD were pickier. Some found that kids with ADHD were more sensitive, but not more picky. Some found that they were pickier, but not more sensitive to smell. So we're in an area with very little replicated research. Hopefully we will be getting more of that. And I think increasingly down the line, rather than just looking at taste, which is interesting in feeding, one serious question, again, since chemosensitivity and how you are smelling the people around you is important for affiliation, making connections, aggression, a whole sort of other things, is whether some of these social issues and problems that have measured in people with ADHD may be partly due to differences in olfactory processing. That, to me, is an interesting area for research, and I can't say much more about it. So in summary, I would not claim HyperSmell to be an ADHD overall superpower. If yours is great, good. If you haven't gotten COVID yet, keep working to protect yourself from COVID. And I do see there's several questions, so I'm going to be switching to them in a second. So transcription says, oh, wow, I thought this might have been connected with asthma. I knew it was a symptom in narcolepsy. So yes, we know there's an overabundance of asthma and a host of autoimmune issues associated with ADHD. I'm not going to bring in the narcolepsy because I'm not that aware with narcolepsy and smell. I'd say certainly the sense of smell has been implicated, again, partly because it's probably part of the nervous system that's out there exposed to the world, but both in Parkinson's and in Alzheimer's disease, there is clear, well-documented degradation of olfactory systems decades before cognitive problems are showing up. So, hello, Dennis, again. So just a pro tip. So Dennis is giving some technical advice on my connection. I am unfortunately dependent on Elon Musk and Starlink here, and the last 2 weeks have been particularly bad. So I hope the sound was not too terrible today. So Dennis's next question is, can olfactory function vary throughout the day based on circadian patterns? So one of the interesting things, and it's Noam Sobel's lab, Sobel, is doing a lot of work on this 2.5 hour. So it's not circadian, which would be about a 24-hour pattern, but we clearly switch preference from inhaling versus one nostril versus another. His group has also shown that people tend to smell. Oh, I'm going to get that wrong, so I'm not going to say it. So I don't know that we know much about I just don't know about sensitivity to smell and circadian rhythms, given that almost everything else in the body, in the brain, is driven to some extent by circadian factors. I would certainly think so. And particularly given, again, that I would frame it that the olfactory system is more subject to interference, interaction, or being subjugated or to other senses. So if you're visually more alert or attuned to something, you're going to be less aware of a smell at a certain time of day, just because other factors may be more strongly on board. So clearly, again, smell, olfaction taps into interesting pathways, and the good thing is more and more researchers are working on it. And again, not just laboratory researchers, but big groups like Google, because they know making a healthier, happier, more connected world is tied into smell and not just sound and vision and other senses we've paid more attention to. So next week, if my back is holding out and the technology is holding out, I'll be back. It will be 4th of July. Double check what time I will try. If this is a better time for people, let me know. And the topic next week is going to be on violence. So non-ADD, it's going to be more violence, suicide, and death, and what do we really know? So stay healthy, stay happy, and have a good week.